Welcome, everybody, to this morning's session, a panel that we hope will continue the very interesting conversations that we had last night with that wonderful presentation by Mary Evelyn Tucker. Before we get underway, there are a couple of things that I thought would be worthwhile to call to your attention. I don't know if you've had a chance to read the Times yet today, but there were three very interesting pieces in there that are relevant to our conversations. One, the hawk that lives above Central Park. Marvelous picture. Two, the Rhine and its return to some sort of viability. There are salmon now back in the Rhine. I'm not sure I'd want to eat them, but at least they're there. And third, a really interesting and funny article that you have to read on the op-ed page by Tom Friedman, talking about the greenest generation. Come on, kids, he says. This is after a visit up to Williams College, when he learned the expression, doing it in the dark, which has nothing to do with what undergraduates might otherwise be engaged in, and has to do with study, turning out the lights, right, and getting your CO2 emissions down. Come on, kids, wake up and smell the CO2. Everybody make your school do it in the dark, says he. So read that article. I just want to say something about what we're doing to do it in the dark. We had, as a matter of fact, Earth Day celebrated here yesterday, and our students who are working on environmental issues made us do an energy fast where we turned out the lights and did it all in the dark here yesterday. We also are involved in a little project to have a photovoltaic array put on the top of one of the flat roofs over here in the Cannon Street apartments, generating some clean green power for us. And we've started some conversations about what to do with some of our back buildings here and our new student apartments that we hope to build in the next 6 to 8 years. In fact, Jonathan Rose has been very helpful in giving us some initial ideas about how to do that and do that right. So we're very much concerned with all of these issues, and we're also concerned with the long-run impact of our educational program here on our students. We've just hired a new faculty colleague in ethics who specializes in environmental ethics. And so some of the conversations that we're starting here today, I think, will be carried on a regular basis with that new collegial support. Well, without further ado, let me turn over the podium here to the chair of our panel, Emilie Towns, a distinguished senior colleague at the Divinity School, who joined us this last year, coming from a Union Theological Seminary, where she held an endowed chair. She is now the Andrew Mellon Professor of African American Studies and Ethics here at Yale Divinity School, and has thrown herself into the life of this community in a marvelous way. She's a great colleague and a marvelously productive scholar. She has a new book coming out in October on womanist ethics and the cultural production of evil. So stay tuned for that one. I'm going to let her introduce the rest of the panel and look forward to the conversation this morning.
Good morning, one and all. Am I hearable? That's usually not an issue, but I thought I'd check. Again, let me extend a welcome to you all this morning on this very fine day. It's good to see you all here. I am not going to spend a good deal of time introducing our panel because you have their bios, and I always, as someone who sits in conferences and consultations way too much, I get very irritated when somebody reads me the bio I could read for myself. So I would encourage you all to read everyone's bio, see who they are. You will notice that there is a strong Union Theological Seminary emphasis on this panel. It was not planned. I had very little hand in it, but I am delighted, in fact, that both Cynthia and David could join us for this conversation today. And also, I'm meeting Jonathan for the first time after hearing about him, so it's great to have you here as well, Jonathan. Thank you for coming. And Mary Evelyn, that was a wonderful talk yesterday. I even took notes, which is not a norm for many talks I go to. Usually I have my Palm Pilot out and I'm playing solitaire to keep engaged so I can listen in that way. It's the I guess it's now the high-tech version of doodling.
Or knitting.
Or knitting, yeah. So, welcome one and all, and welcome to this fine panel. It is a great honor to have you all here with us this day. Let me give you a sense of the flow and what we hope to accomplish in this short amount of time we have today. Each panelist will not spend a great deal of time talking, which means you must listen carefully because they're going to be packing a lot into a little. Our whole hope for this morning is that the panel gives you grist for a mill, your mill. And in fact, what we do then is throw the conversation into your hands to talk about ways in which each of us can think through how we can be resources in the kinds of issues that help bring about a more sustainable Earth, a more sustainable cosmos, most likely, and the ways in which we can be active participants in it. So we're going to ask you to talk this morning and not just listen. So that is our hope for this time, which will be just a little over an hour we will have to do this with one another. So with that, let me just say the order of the panelists will go. We will begin with Cynthia Moe-Lobeda, and then move to David Wellman, and then to create a more flow, we go back to Jonathan, and then we end and really begin again with Mary Evelyn. Let me just give this as a thought for you as you're listening to the panel. It was something that Mary Evelyn said yesterday that just I am still troubled by. And that was the two examples she gave of the two students. The one student whose response is, well, why should I care? Well, I want to change that to why should we care? Versus the other student whose reaction when he's reading a similar body of work, actually, becomes so immobile that he retreats to his room and can't really communicate for a whole weekend. And then when he's able to talk again, his reaction is that of despair. Arrogant cynicism on one hand, despair on the other. And then what Mary Evelyn suggested then is that's not enough, and I would agree. I wouldn't be a social ethicist if I thought despair was a good thing. It's probably my stock in trade, but it's not a good thing. The answer then is to think about hope and possibilities. And so with that kind of framing, we can see many of the realities of what is going on in the environment, in our ecological systems, and what's happening in different religious communities. And it can be a grim task to sort of wade through that material. But there's always hope. There's always possibilities. And so how can we think about that today? So with that, Cynthia.
I thank you for the opportunity to share some of my hopes and fears with you. And I need to express real gratitude to Yale Divinity School and the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies for the gracious way in which they have been in communication with me. It's been absolutely lovely to have that contact. Humankind today faces a moral, spiritual challenge never before known. Never before has one species threatened Earth's capacity to sustain life as we know it. Something new is asked of humankind today. Our great work, as Thomas Berry puts it, is to forge a mutually enhancing relationship between the human species and planet Earth. That, of course, is the sacred work around which you have so wisely gathered. It truly is my privilege to be here with you in it. I would argue that all of Earth's great faith traditions must plumb the depths of their moral, spiritual wisdom, seeking guidance for this work, and must put that wisdom in dialogue with other bodies of human knowledge. Again, this is what I see you proposing. As a Christian theologian and ethicist, I ask, what do Christian traditions bring to this task? I've worked with Christians from every continent, and in doing so, I've found this. The ecological movement within the church worldwide, though it be small, is uncovering within Christian traditions a treasure trove of resources for the fourth great revolution in human history, that being the ecological revolution. Some refer to this movement within the church as earth-honoring Christianities, or the movement toward earth-honoring Christianities, or green churches. Consider just a few illustrations of what the church is currently bringing. First is acknowledging and repenting for the role that Christian theology has played in contributing to Earth's distress. Repentance means turning the other direction, and the Christian ecological movement is struggling to do so. A second move underway is recovering an ancient Christian theology of the cosmos. That theology claims that God's salvation includes all of creation, not just one species. God, in fact, according to this theology, while beyond material things, also dwells within Earth's creatures and elements, even the tiniest leaf, to quote a 16th century theologian. What will happen when the church pays as much attention to God dwelling, flowing, and pouring through all things as we do to certain other issues of our day? A third thing that the church is bringing is a claim about the purpose of human life. It says that all humans are given a vocation, a calling, a reason for being. And that reason for being is to receive the love of God, and then to live that mysterious and marvelous love into the world. That love, however, is not a Hallmark card kind of a feeling. That love is actively reorienting all aspects of life to serve God's purposes, including Earth's restoration. As I work with undergraduate students, letting them get a grip on the concept that their reason for being is just that has been thrilling. Another gift that the church brings is the insistence that we recognize sin not only as individual deeds, but also as institutions and social systems that oppress or exploit people or damage Earth's regenerative capacities. A related resource is the insistence that God, the lover of creation, is also God, the lover of social justice. The ecological movement must never set itself aside from the movement towards social justice. The two are intertwined. A final resource that I will mention at this point, and I could talk for hours about what the ecological movement within the church is bringing, but the final thing that I'll mention now is something that I find absolutely necessary if we are to face honestly the magnitude of Earth's distress at human hands. And I really do mean I find this resource absolutely necessary, because I have faced despair in my own life regarding ecological and social injustice. And to me, the necessary gift that the Christian tradition is bringing is the conviction that the great mystery that some call God is drawn instinctively to the broken places in life, and there draws forth power that we did not know we had. Power for struggle toward mutually life-giving Earth-human relations. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm so delighted to be here this morning in a conversation which includes students and scholars of forestry, environmental science, and religion. Now, while I join this conversation as a religious ethicist, I'm also here as someone who has worked with his father on a 160-acre tree farm in Washington State for the last 18 years. On this farm, we grow Douglas fir for timber. The work my father and I have been long doing is deeply indebted to the imagination and innovation of those who teach forestry and environmental science. Without you, we would not understand the concept of sustainable forestry, nor would we know the best way and time to thin our trees, what and where to plant, and how to put together a credible long-term plan for our farm. Along with actual hands-on experience, I've probably learned the most about forestry from a dear family friend who in the 1930s graduated from forestry school in Pennsylvania and upon graduation came to work in the Pacific Northwest as a timber cruiser and a faller before becoming an environmental activist. Among the things I learned from our friend Al, to my astonishment, was that many of the lessons he learned in the 1930s in forestry school have yet to be fully embraced by the timber industry. Herein lies the extraordinary opportunity we have before us today as a collective body, to examine how we can persuade people in the field to more fully employ the wisdom and underlying logic of cleaving to Earth's economy rather than the far and more artificial and detached human economy. I regret to say that historically, many ethical expressions of religion have served to undermine this goal. Our interpretations of many creation stories in the West, for example, have long portrayed the human as the natural owner and master of the non-human members of the ecosphere. These anthropocentric theologies have readily supported the aims of many in the timber industry, who have often privileged short-term profit over long-term responsibility. Many, I regret to say, hold that such policies reflect the correct human role, be they secular or religious thinkers. They say that the land is ours to do with as we please. To question this assumption, many argue, is to question what all too many still believe to be the human's rightful place. In light of this popular position, it seems to me that together we must answer two questions. One, how can we practice the lessons of sustainability which science provides, while offering an ethical and theological rationale which effectively rebuts anthropocentric economic worldviews? And two, how can secular and religious academicians who support ecological sustainability move towards a common language that is compelling, intelligible, and useful to those who work or own the land and who do not or never will speak the language of the academy? Thank you.
The environmental world was, about a year or so ago, was rocked by an article called The Death of Environmentalism, which said that the environmental movement was losing power because it lacked values. And out of that has come a groping, really, in the environmental world to try and find the values that they're accused of lacking, that in fact are intrinsic in the hearts of most environmentalists, but have not been articulated. And at the same time, we have seen in the religious world a longing for its last great time in which its values were connected with action, which was the civil rights movement. It was a time in which faith was transformative. So we see these two great movements who are seeking something that each has, that they can share together. And so I suggest that the coming together of religion and environment is not a marriage of convenience, but rather think of it as two lovers who have this great passion for something that they share together, who are coming together in the care for creation. The context of that coming together is climate change. There is no greater man-made transformation of the environment that threatens creation as much as climate change. And I encourage you all in late May to see Al Gore's movie. Al Gore has a new movie out about climate change, which is apparently quite shocking. There is a core common motivation, and that is compassion. And the driver of the compassion is a sense of environmental justice. I have been involved in dozens and dozens of conversations about religion and environment, and what ultimately comes out is always that the arrogance of the wealthy, it will impact first, it'll impact us all, but first the lives of the poor. The elucidating moment was Katrina, which laid bare the issues of environmental justice. And our sense is that together, this movement has enormous power to be transformative to individuals' lives, to communities of interest, and hopefully to change the course of man's destruction of the environment.
Thank you, colleagues, for those wonderful and succinct remarks. I want to simply say that the opening here is quite extraordinary because this understanding now that science and policy are necessary but not sufficient, and that scientists and policymakers here at Yale and elsewhere are inviting us into this new conversation is, I think, an absolutely significant and historical moment, and we need to seize the opportunity. Gorbachev held 2 conferences in Europe in the last several years to say, Earth Dialogues is ethics the missing link. And clearly that is the missing link, and that's why this opportunity is opening here at Yale and elsewhere. Now, I could say a lot about scientists that are literally calling us to this and policymakers, but I'll just refer briefly to a few. Ed Wilson at Harvard has been saying for a long time the religious community needs to engage this issue. Peter Raven at the Missouri National Gardens has been saying for many, many years, we are killing our world. We need a moral vision. Paul Ehrlich, the biologist at Stanford, said after the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment Report that we need a Millennium Assessment of human behavior, and he is dedicating the rest of his career to trying to understand the motivational and moral issues that are engaged here. He will be a partner with us in this. Policy people like the World Watch Institute did a whole chapter in their State of the World Report 2003, and one of their issues, number 164, is documenting what the religious communities are doing here. Now, I would like to suggest our task would be along these lines, and I'm just making 4 suggestions among many others, and I hope that we'll have conversation on this not only today, but in future months and years. The first task, I think, is to create a conversation. Now, that sounds very elementary, but I sincerely mean that the language we will create will be essential to making traction with real-world issues. And the understanding of religion, ethics, values, and spirituality is not well known outside circles like this or divinity schools like this. We need to speak, as Emilie has called us, to the public issues and make this language transformable and transferable. So this is the first task, to create a conversation that has a new and effective language. Secondly, and by the way, that task means a conversation that brings together facts and values, because that split has created such a confusion about here are the scientific facts, here's a possibility for action, but where is the connection? So that's the task of this conversation. Secondly, we need to create a new discipline of religion and ecology. We need to take this to another level. And that is a discipline that has discipline for transformation. We need to create not just the goodwill, but the intellectual force and power and ideas from science and policy and religion. This new discipline that has a discipline for transformation. And thirdly, I would say this alliance of religion and ecology is a transformative alliance, and we need to see it as such. It's not just advocacy. It's a powerful, deep, complex, and mysterious transformative alliance that calls us to who we are as humans in this particular moment, as our speakers have just spoken. And that transformative alliance means that the changes that will take place involve this concentric circle of local, of national, and international transformations. What we do on a local level will impact, will reach out, will affect. But we need to be very strategic and to say this is not just about changing light bulbs in churches. It's not just about sermons, which are deeply needed. They are most definitely needed. But it's also realizing that strategic and systemic change needs to be addressed. Eco-justice issues are at the heart of the matter here. And finally, I would suggest, and I think that Yale, with the leadership of Gus Speth and Harry Attridge and others here, are positioned to take up in a way that I have not seen anywhere in the country in giving talks at various universities. I think the opportunity here is to define a new sense of trusteeship. We are trustees for many institutions in our society: cultural, educational, religious. We want to be trustees of these institutions for the next generation. And I would suggest that our great task now is to be trustees for the Earth community, for its myriad forms of life, for its ecosystems. And I would love to help us together envision a sense. At the United Nations, there is a room called the Trusteeship Council Room. That room has been virtually unused for the most part since the post-colonial period, when the notion of trusteeship was completely transformed. And I would suggest that the task here before us is to redefine the sense of trusteeship for the Earth community and to have in that room a new alliance, a transformative alliance of speakers, of movements, of grassroots people, of leaders from around the world, where trusteeship will indeed be for future generations and for the entire Earth community. Thank you very much.
Take a deep breath. Put on your best thinking, feeling, knowing, doing, being caps or whatever it is you put on your head to do good work. And let's begin to have a conversation with one another. Thank you to the panel for actually doing what I asked you to do. I'm amazed. But I don't know if it was threat or reality that did it, but they did.
Awesome leadership.
Awesome. Oh, thank you, thank you. But I asked them to speak no more than 3 to 5 minutes, and everyone did 3, basically, close to 3. So thank you so much. Let me give a little bit of primer for the first person who's going to speak out loud with the microphone. We have our own Oprah here who will come with you, to you with the microphone. And that is some things that jumped out at me as I was listening to everyone. First, and not only, but just things that caught my ear. Cynthia's understanding or giving us the imaginative universe of a God who is drawn instinctively to the broken places in life. Not to make those places okay, but to transform them with a power that can be found in that. David's questions to us. What can folks who are in the sciences provide while offering an ethical and theological rationale that undoes this, it's all about me and my family and my house and my people? And then how can we move towards a common language that is useful in talking about the air we breathe, the people we are and are not? Jonathan's wonderful image of we should think of this as 2 lovers. And we know that's going to be a little messy. But that's okay. Because in the figuring out of how one loves another, one has to figure out how one loves oneself. And then create an environment where things, the rest of the cosmos, the rest of creation, our ecological, our environmental homes flourish. And then Mary Evelyn's sense of creating a conversation, that she's returned us to that several times. Creating a conversation, again, with Cynthia's notion of a common language. And I suspect that's why we haven't talked a lot in this conversation so far about faith, but more about values and virtues, but more about values, because values language is in some ways expansive enough that we can enter wherever we are religiously and begin to talk to each other out of a sense of finding that kind of common language. And with that, she presented to you this new sense of trusteeship, which I think has powerful implications for how we think about what we are to do, all of us, not just as the two boards of two schools at Yale, but all of us as human beings seated, living in a world that is growing and dynamic, and we're often killing it. So how do we do these things? So those were some of the things that I heard our speakers pushing us to think about, the imagery they were giving us to think about it as well. So I now throw it to you. What are some of the things that are coming to your mind as you've heard us begin this morning? And could you say your name, Jan? I can see your name from here, but others.
this week about the media and the environment. Despite the fact that scientists have 99% proof that human action is involved in the global warming, the media, in its misguided effort to be balanced, is actually being biased because they're giving equal time to both sides, even though the side that says there is no environmental problem, it's human caused, is tiny and it's business probably sponsored. And so it's a very interesting point to me that the media, which is actually our lifeline to the democracy, is not giving us true information. They're giving us a bias because they think that balance applies to science. And balance really should apply only to opinions. So I think we want to put the media in our mission here.
Any response from?
I couldn't agree more, and at the Aspen Conference on Climate Change, this was a big part of the conversation, exactly your point about the difference between bias and balance. I would like to suggest, not to be just Pollyanna-ish and so on, but I think that the Time magazine 2 weeks ago of global warming and that why we have to be worried is, I think, a significant breakthrough to say that mainstream media is getting this. And I bought up 12 copies and took it down to Costa Rica for the Earth Charter meeting and said the U.S. is finally joining the international community here. And people were delighted to see this. And as we all know, I have never bought Vanity Fair in my life, but this week's Vanity Fair is a big green issue. Now, I think we're making some headway. When we have a BBC in this country that actually reports the news, we will really be on the cutting edge. But in the meantime, we have some forms of hope in those publications that have broken the barrier.
That could be my question.
Yeah, exactly.
But
We're looking at you.
Well, one thing is to look around this room and see who's not here and who needs to be here in this kind of conversation that we're having. Because I think that, for me at least, I was born in 1955. I grew up in a family system where you celebrated each year you got older because it wasn't guaranteed, so we don't mind telling our ages among the women in our family at all. But I was born in 1955 in Durham, North Carolina, which is in the news for all sorts of the wrong reasons right now. And so it was still the segregated South. And so I have enough imageries, and both my parents were college professors. Not at Duke, but at North Carolina Central University. I grew up in a situation where I didn't know Duke existed until I was in the 4th grade. That's how strict the color line was in Durham. So I can remember the no colored signs. I've been spat on. There are lots of tales I can tell, and I'm only 50 years old. But I remember those things. But I'm also was old enough in the 60s to see the kinds of changes that happened. And what happened around the killing of one individual and how dreams often began to be shattered because there was not a movement really built. Too much was centered around individuals. And so for me, one of the lessons of the civil rights movement is we're the ones we've been waiting for. We can't look to an individual. We need to look to ourselves. We need to become our own best resources, realizing that that will be flawed, but that's okay. We're not asking for perfection here. I'm Baptist, so perfection's not one of those things that's high on my list. But it is a sense of we've got to try. Failure is not an absolute. It's an attempt to try and be the best at what we can do. And so that, for me, becomes a part of what we can learn from the civil rights movement. And something that Mary Evelyn was pointing us to yesterday that is so problematic in our kind of culture is that we now have 2 to 3 generations of folk who have been raised in a culture of crass individualism. The sense of community and communal is something when I talk to them, they're intrigued by and they know it's something they need, but they have not been raised with the kinds of heftiness you have to really get into building communities. And so I think that's another task for us as we're thinking about this. I think part of the reason why we see what we see with what we do to the environment is that we don't understand our individual acts are not individual acts. They have profound repercussions for those around us. Enough people I watched a young woman throw a cigarette butt out of the car this morning while I was coming into work. And I thought, if enough people do that, that's a mess. That's an ecological mess. One person, it is easily lost. So trying to get a sense of what it would mean for us to really work together. Now that doesn't mean there can't be folks like Mary Evelyn and Jonathan out there sort of leading us in directions, but they cannot do that work by themselves, and I don't think either of them would suggest they could. You only work best when you work with others, I think. And so those are some of the lessons from the civil rights movement. And no, it was not going to be popular when you speak the truth. And finally, don't wait for the media to recognize it. I'm a part of too many progressive religious organizational conversations to know that progressive religious communities are not rolling over and playing dead. They are proliferating by the thousands. On some days it feels like. And they're working and they're having an impact. And so for us to trust the media to give us in this country, to give us an accurate reading on what's really going on, I've become not an arrogant cynic, but a faithful cynic around that. And so those are some of the things that come to mind.
Can I add one thing to that? One of Martin Luther King's most used phrases or words was interdependence. And he consistently said that we have to see the whole rather than parts and see that we are all in this together. And interdependence is really the underlying premise of ecology and the environment, of understanding how that everything is one and everything co-evolves. It is also the underlying sense of faith, is really the sense of oneness of things. And I think the civil rights movement was the strongest time, at least in my lifetime, in which that sense that it was the human task of people of faith to create wholeness by recognizing interdependence.
And proud of it.
Exactly.
Could I speak to that? Do you have to pick this up or just?
No,
just hold it. I think that is one of the most crucial questions there is. I frame it somewhat differently. I frame it as where do we find the moral power, the moral agency to do what needs to be done? We know, as a human species, we've found paths toward more sustainable relationship, but wherein lies the moral, spiritual power to do that is a crucial, crucial question. I've oriented classes around that question. And your language of we need different people is powerful, again, in another sense, because we're talking about we. And this is a small piece of the we. There are people throughout the globe, on many continents, working toward, in multiple ways, sustainability. Grassroots people all over the place that we don't see, we're not aware of. People, particularly in the two-thirds world, in Africa, in Latin America, this small we, has a great deal to learn from different people, from people already engaged and for whom it is a life necessity to be building more sustainable ways of living. We need, I think, to hear not only from us, the educated, the quote-unquote experts, but from people on the ground in other parts of the world. There is no continent on earth where the movement is less visible in the public discourse than here. Mm-hmm. We are burdened by not having visible, and it's partly the media, but the visible struggle. And I mean that with great seriousness. It's tremendous burden not to have that as visible as it is in other parts of the world, where it is more clearly a life and death issue to many people who are poor. I would say, in terms of the motivation for us, or I would call the moral spiritual power, Frances Moe-Lobeda, the founder of Food First, once asked, what is it that enables us to accept as individuals 30,000 silent deaths every day to hunger? Why do we accept it when we couldn't imagine allowing that in our own lives, letting one child go hungry? Do you see what I'm saying? How is it that we accept destroying Earth's life systems? She said it's ideas. Our ideas, for instance, the ideas about the necessity of growth, the nature of human freedom. Human freedom is vastly different than how we conceive of it. Growth that is not pro-poor and pro-environmental growth is not growth that we should be seeking. But I don't believe ideas alone are sufficient. I also believe that a moral horizon, a vision of the future that is pragmatic but also beyond pragmatic. And again, that is one of the places religion can come in. Religions have a vision of the future in which, in the Jewish tradition, the shalom, the great shalom. In Christian tradition, the restoration of all. So to me, the combination of ideas challenging our presuppositions, I think we should walk around with a boilerplate in our minds that says, what here is being presupposed to be natural or normal or inevitable or God's will that isn't? I tell my students, if you come out of my class with that question in mind all the time, it will serve for transformation. So ideas and encountering those who are struggling already in other parts of the world and in neighborhoods here that aren't in the public discourse. And a vision, this moral vision that I think is one of the great things that religious traditions can provide. Martin Luther King had the vision that the arch of the universe is toward justice. That's the way the universe is structured. And that's an ancient theology, that the universe is structured toward restoration by the power of the sacred and humans living it out. So those are just a few comments in relationship to that question.
If I might, I just wanted to echo a couple points Cynthia made. I'm sure that I'm not alone among people here who have had the privilege of traveling outside of the United States and spending significant amounts of time in other countries. And I must say that for myself, that experience has been extraordinarily liberating, because I realize that in fact the way that we live and the choices that we make in the economic north are simply one way of living. They are not the only way of living. And I was very heartened to hear the stories that Mary Evelyn shared with us last night regarding different movements around the world that are accomplishing extraordinary things that really are beyond the ken of many people right now in the United States. And so I think that one of the things that people in the economic north, and when I say the economic north, of course I mean people north of the hemisphere and those living in south of the hemisphere in very wealthy circumstances, need to let go of the illusion that all solutions are going to come from our cultural context, our economic circumstances, and we need to redefine who are the teachers and who are the students, because I think for too long we in the North have named ourselves as the only teachers. I also have been thinking a lot this last week about how Cynthia's and my mentor, Larry Rasmussen, defines the moral guidepost of sustainability, and he says that it's supported by a number of other guideposts. He says there is no sustainability without justice. There is no sustainability without participation by everybody. There's no sustainability without material simplicity, without spiritual richness, and without subsidiarity. And therefore, lots of the best ideas can come in the local context, do not have to be these meta ideas that we impose on other people. And I think that listening is perhaps one of the most important words that we need to apply to our work now.
I think this point about creation that you all talked about is so important. It doesn't matter what country you're talking about. One of the alarming statistics I've heard in this country is how down used to have some years ago 11,000 participants, now down to 4,000. I think it's important that the younger people have to get out in the world to see how the world really works. And you really, if the earth is this wonderful filter system, all you really have to do is think about water and what we're doing to this filter system and what we're doing to creation to eliminate or cause all the filters. So I think if we can get people out to the rivers or to Wellman pond and focus on creation, and I think it would help, and I think if we even teach people to slow down.
My name is Peter Cooper. I'm a lawyer here in New Haven, and I was interested in the observation that we need to develop a new sense of trusteeship. Well, being a lawyer, I think of what's another word for trusteeship, and fiduciary is that word. And if you think of the origin of the word fiduciary, that gets back to faith, and maybe we can start to build some bridges as this group is trying to do. And whether it's a lawyer or, as Gus was pointing out, whether there are new people who have to be brought into the circle here, someone in a fiduciary or trustee capacity really is going outside of themselves, really is trying to think of what they're trying to help protect for the future. So that I think this is a way to try to help grope toward language that can be more useful, more helpful for so many people.
Let's come over here, and then we'll get back to you. Don't worry.
I'm Jeannie Graustein, and I work for the Catholic Archdiocese of Hartford, which includes the New Haven area. And I'd like to just touch on several of the things that have been raised by way of examples, and I guess a question at the end of how do we build more of this and how do we connect the academy as well as the churches with it. we've taken a focus over the years on environmental justice and care of creation, that care of neighbor can't be separated from care of creation. And we've worked closely with local grassroots organizations, including the Connecticut Coalition for Environmental Justice. We've taken church leaders on a toxic tour in Hartford that we called St. Francis, Your Trash and Children's Health, to try to help people see the interconnections. We've taken the state garbage plan and created a map town by town to show where all our individual trash is going. From 77 towns, it goes to Hartford where it's burned to create electric power. Why are so many facilities concentrated? Then we get into the advocacy end. We have an advocacy network of about 6,000 people around the state, and we're pushing the current environmental justice bill that's in the state legislature right now. We try to show people what they can do in their churches, in their homes, how they can hook up with grassroots organizations to work in the local community with people who are experiencing the injustices that need to be changed around environmental issues and health. So there are very rich things going on out there that we can connect with. We don't have to create them, but it does come back to vision and imagination. How do we then explain to our people in terms of our church social teaching and living out the gospel what these connections are, that it's not all separate, it's all totally interconnected, which of course is an ecological view as well as a view of human community and the human community within the natural community. So I mean, there's lots going on across the country through all faith traditions. And I think if we did have more of it in the media in positive ways, we'd all be more encouraged and have examples that we could learn from. So I guess my question is how to build more of these connections into what students are experiencing, what people are teaching, what we're sending people out into the world to do.
Just very briefly in relation to Gus's question and Jeannie's point here, one thing we are doing that I mentioned yesterday is we are doing a film of these grassroots movements in the U.S. and hopefully in other parts of the world. And on the Harvard website that we created, there's about 100 of these grassroots movements listed, and we hope to network them with a conference and so on. And we're also working, I'm leaving tonight for Greece, and we're doing a film there with the director who did the Cosmos series a number of years ago with Carl Sagan. And we're doing a film on the universe story of Thomas Berry's perspective, and we hope to have that on public television next fall. And David Kennard, the director, is pretty effective at realizing this need for interconnection on this kind of cosmological level. So I hope that will bring the numbers that Gus is talking about into the conversation. And a final point, I think, is the Earth Charter movement has inspired hundreds of thousands of people around the world, and some of the activities that have taken place have been absolutely mind-boggling. And that's something I think we can connect to very, very effectively.
I'm Strawn Donnelly. I'm a philosopher and a part-time ethicist. And it's a rare chance that you can legitimately speak up. Thank you, Gus, and others. I think we all agree that we're in a very deep cultural crisis. And certainly part of that crisis is our ideas of nature and our relations to nature. And I think we really have to very deeply rethink our worldviews. And sort of, I think one thing we have to do, we have to naturalize American citizens. We have to naturalize philosophy, because God knows it's not naturalized now. We have to naturalize ethics. We've got to naturalize our theologies and our religions. And if we're going to do that, one of the many 800-pound gorillas that is right here on this rug is, if we're going to have a naturalist worldview, we're going to have to think seriously about Darwin. And religions and theologies are going to have to seriously think about Darwin and how can there be an integration of thinking that can include the best insights of evolutionary and ecological biology along with the other naturalist traditions. Just a little challenge.
Just a little. Let's go way in the back. I'm trying to get a spread around the room. We're going to create this sort of synergy. Right to your right. There you go.
I'm Jeff Braun. I found this conference so far just incredibly informative, but also inspiring, as I'm hidden behind the Alleluia signs, right? I guess that's a better view than my face anyway, so I guess I'm the letter L. I'm intrigued by this idea of environmental justice and the way in which care for our environment and social justice merge in a very holistic way. And it does merge in different ways depending on your vantage point, but I'm a pastor, so I'm coming at it from the faith perspective. I live in Redding, Connecticut. Land conservation in Redding, Connecticut is without peer in Fairfield County. They have done an exquisite job of maintaining and preserving open space, but a very unintended byproduct of that is that the real estate value in Redding continues to increase, and parcels of land continue to grow in size, those inhabited and those uninhabited, and it becomes more and more exclusionary. Emilie, you talked about who is not here in this conversation. Well, I can point at my church, which I love deeply, and which is a greatly spiritual place, and say there are a lot of groups that are not represented. And there are economic reasons for a lot of that. And I'm wondering, in the spirit of Martin Luther King's idea of interdependence, how do we ensure that land conservation, that piece of our ecological care taking, how do we make sure that land conservation works in concert with, not in conflict with, this social justice piece? So we have environmental justice, both sides.
Jonathan, that sounds like your kind of question.
We should also get Chris Sawyer on that.
So why don't we hear from Chris first?
Okay. Chris, do you want to make a comment? TPL's done wonderful work in this regard.
It's a challenge. So, and I don't mean to be flip when I say that, but you just got to look at the total picture and realize that's part of the equation. You got to speak to it with your work, and I could give you examples of what a number of the organizations, including TPL, are doing about it. I mean, one thing we've clearly done is consciously looked at the on one side of improving the parks in our inner cities. Look at our community garden. Rose Harvey was here last night. Rose Harvey and her team, they've probably created 150 community gardens in the poor sections of New York City. Another thing we've done that trying to look at this issue is that there are 300 schools in New York City that don't have playgrounds. You don't have a playground, live in that city, you can have an idea what your kids are doing with their free time. It's not what you want them to do. And so we've systematically started trying to find lots that we can buy, and then we raise money and put really nice playgrounds on it. Now, the issue about driving land values up, one way that I like to stop that is by helping put green belts around cities so you can't go out, which means that you're going to have to increase your densities. And of course, we're talking about seismic changes. That is the seismic change that we're all going to have in our housing patterns. I was at a conference, as I mentioned last night, in Seattle, and a world-class designer got up and planner, and he said, with the population we're looking at by 2050, and he didn't explain this number, but he said by 2050 the world needs to be on a three families per acre basis, and the U.S. needs, with its population, it has to be at 7 units per acre. And that's a total different change in our lifestyle that just the population numbers are going to do. And so that's going to drive a lot of the discussion that you're talking about. I would like to say one other thing that relates really to Gus's comment and a couple of y'all's comments as well. We don't need to lose anybody. So the lawyers and the scientists need to stay right here with us. They don't need to go anywhere, particularly right now. But one of the reasons that I've been so interested in getting these two groups together is one of the things I've learned in the conservation movement is that we have this thought that these organizations are taking care of all these problems and that we've got going on what needs to be going on. And I have tried, because I've been very directly involved in it, is the legislative priorities of the land conservation movement the last 7 years, and which predates Bush. And I'll simply report to you that our major organizations, including the 4 that I work with very directly, we've pushed a legislative agenda for 6.5, 7 years now that is now distilled down to a bill that's in conference. And if it gets passed, it's $35 million a year for the next 2 years. And that's without changing the bill language. It is what our community has asked for, okay? So I would say that it's not the media that's kind of failed us, it's ourselves. But yet if you look at it from a different perspective and say, let's take the 2 bills that were put forward by the entire land conservation community, the way of looking at it, that where it rationalizes itself, is that if you were running those organizations, as some of us are, you'd look at it and say, what can we do to expand our revenue base and our sense of mission accomplishment by 15 to 20% in a year? And these bills are the perfect medicine for that, okay? But it's not their mission, their job, nor do they have the capacity to take care of the whole issue, because they're just not about that business. So I look at this question and that we're all trying to figure out, which is how do you get people to convert their lifestyles? And how do you take care of this, much broader issue of what we're doing? And I really do think that we're going to have to start thinking about new organizations to accomplish it, new groups of gatherings of people. And one reason this particular group, the 2 schools, is so appropriate is that we're all experienced and educated and informed about most of these issues, but we're not necessarily encumbered with running a particular organization out there doing field work. So we can see the need, we can see the responsibility, we can see the duty, and so to me it's the perfect environment, no pun intended, to figure out where this new leadership's coming from that's going to tap all of these resources we've been talking about and all this good work we've been talking about, but really levitate it to a totally new level, which all of us so desperately need. So, I'll sit down.
Can I make a very brief comment? Sure. So just very briefly, there's a growing movement of land trusts also incorporating affordable housing, and bringing those 2 fields together, and in fact preserving large parcels of land and building a little bit of affordable housing. If you look at the Westchester Land Trust, which is nearby to Reading, in Westchester County, it's in their charter to do both affordable housing. A last example is that in Aspen, there has been a very popular tax on the sale of homes, of which 1/3 goes to affordable housing, 1/3 goes to open space, and 1/3 goes to daycare, bringing 3 constituencies so that tax has been passed every time it comes up for vote in the last 25 years or so.
If I could make an observation and then pose a question. That I'm greatly struck by this, the reference to the civil rights movement. I was here on this campus in the first half of the 60s when that was the social issue of our time. And I would observe that the moral and ethical force of that issue united people of all kinds of backgrounds, all kinds of different philosophies, whether they be economic philosophies or political philosophies, or even whether it's conservative economics or abortion, or you name it. This issue overrode that issue, and I think that's what we're facing today. Fred Krupp told me last night he had a conversation with President Bush very recently. He said it was extremely hopeful that the president actually listened and responded positively. With all due respect to Fred's intelligence and charm, I would suggest to you that the president is suddenly become aware the fact that major faith-based institutions in this country have cited the environment as an important issue for the future, and that's what he's responding to. And this issue is going to be an enormous uniting issue as long as we keep pushing. Now, having said that, if I could ask a question related to Strawn Donnelly's point about evolution. as I was thinking about how we were celebrating the opportunities of science and religion and ethicism, I couldn't help but think of one or two articles I read about a month, 2 months ago, that the Vatican had said that there is a conflict between religion, their teachings, and science. And I'm wondering if you folks are aware of any dialogue that is going on with the Vatican, or if there's not, should there be? Because that is a major faith-based institution that ought to be joining this effort and not fighting it.
Thank you for that question. About 1.5 years ago, I was at a dialogue at the Vatican on water issues, and it was sponsored by the Pontifical Academy. And so I think that environmental issues are certainly on the screen of the Catholic bishops, and John Paul II did a very important, not encyclical, but letter in January of 1990. I do think, however, that there's a lot of important dialogue on religion and science going on, even apart from the Catholic tradition or other traditions, and that is what's happened with the Institute for Religion in the Age of Science, which is a 40-year-old dialogue on religion and science. It has a major journal, Zygon, that's in the Chicago area. And this summer we're having a conference up on Star Island on emergence as a major theory of evolution, which brings together theologians. Gordon Kaufman will be there from Harvard, and a whole range of terrific scientists. So this is a very vibrant dialogue. And why I refer to the Universe Story film that we're making is precisely to bring together this sense that we are part, as the Earth Charter says, of this vast evolving universe, of which 4.7 billion year evolutionary history is now at stake. And there are fundamentalists on both sides of this argument, scientific fundamentalists who give us a view of the universe as random, as purposeless, as meaningless. And I think we have a reaction from a fundamentalist religious community as well. But as David Kennard, this director, says, we're going down a stream in the middle that says this is a mysterious and sacred process, but that's why I call us to a language that overcomes these differences, to say this huge evolutionary history and what Strong has been saying for many years, that it has to be taken very seriously. And I feel it's a huge source of inspiration. And the Natural History Museum, the Rose Center, their exhibit illustrates this magnificently. And children get it. We're part of something mysterious, and you come out of the Rose Center exhibit, they give you a passport to the universe. People feel they are in a different world. It's an amazing exhibit, and I think it's an amazing moment that we're in now.
Want to add anything? I saw your hand flash on the question with the Vatican.
I think several things are going on. Major Catholic theologians, including the last pope, accept that that evolution happened, that's the way the world developed. The part comes, and I know there was a letter, an op-ed in the New York Times from an Austrian cardinal that muddied the waters greatly. That was not the official Vatican view by any means. What the Vatican tries to say, or what Catholic theologians try to say, is that we may have evolved from, simple organisms, as science says, that can be accepted, but that at some crucial moment, there's something to do with the human spirit and soul. That's not a scientific question, it's a religious and theological statement. So that's really where I think the trouble comes in. There's vast misunderstanding among many Catholics, including some bishops and cardinals, on what evolution means, what science is about. But as Mary Evelyn said, the Pontifical Academy of Science has done a tremendous amount. There are all kinds of publications, and the new Pope in his Easter address used the idea of mutation and evolution as an image for a theological point he was trying to make. So there's more going on there than you would get from the news media, and there's more true scientific understanding on the issue of evolution than you would certainly get. So it's not as bleak as you may think.
Yeah. Cynthia wants to get one thing in, and then I'll take one last question back here.
I wanted to make one point because the civil rights movement has continually come up, and that is this, that for us to address ecological issues, we must include in our account of the problem eco-racism, environmental racism, excuse me. There's a strong movement that sees that Earth's destruction is connected to white privilege, the legacy and the constant presence today of white privilege. And I think that to address it, the ecological destruction, we must include an analysis. So the land thing, about how every time something is done, one should say, how does this benefit white people over people of color? How does it benefit people with money over people who don't have? And I know there's not time to say more, but it's a key element to face white privilege and its connection to ecological destruction.
I'm Peter Bradford. I'd like to revisit the Why Should I Care community for a moment. And to start by questioning whether the aspect of it that's most worrisome is that it's headed off to Wall Street. Because Wall Street is pretty pragmatic. It responds to insurance rates. It responds to risk. And I think by now, Mary Evelyn, your student probably knows the answer to why. He may not like it very much, but he probably knows the answer to why you should care. But there's another why should I care community that seems much more intractable to me. And that's the community that sees our sense of disaster as being their sense of apocalypse, that or of rapture or of end time. And to them, issues like where do we store nuclear waste for 1,000 years, or oil depletion, or gradual warming of the climate isn't very important, because we're in the end time anyway. And Gus's 53% certainly isn't entirely made up of that community, but my sense is that the people in Washington are responding rather more to what that group thinks at the moment than to what this group thinks. And so my question is how those of you more experienced in religious conversation, certainly than I am, would undertake to talk with them, because their sense, it seems to me, is that an awful lot of what's worrying us and what we think if we could just educate other people to understand would worry them too, actually is not disturbing at all. And in some ways, the fundamentalist credo is bring it on.
I think what we will have to do is end with that question.
You mean it's an end of time question?
But when the dean sidles up to the table, that usually means we need to end. And we also have worship coming in here in just a few minutes, so they have to reconfigure the chapel for that. Thank you all for engaging in this time and also thinking through the ways that you might be the ones we've been waiting for.
Let me just give a quick response to that last question and indicate where the conversation is going to continue. You have in your packets an example of our publication here, the journal Reflections. The last issue of that journal actually took up the question that you just put on the table. That is, how one deals with millenarian speculation and how one undercuts it rationally from a theological point of view. I urge you to read that journal. A year from now, we're going to have another version of this journal continuing precisely the conversation that began here today. So it's going to continue, and we're going to have, I hope, an impact on all of the churches and faith communities that somehow are related to this institution. I hope we'll be taking up the Darwin question, taking up the question of where Catholic theology and other theologies intersect with the environment. The conversation will continue.